Thank Peter. Thank you for your work in the Netherlands. Well, we're off to a good start here. We've got a good number of folks in the room. So I know Dr. Angela Dills has some amazing material to share with us this morning. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Michael Donnelly. I'm Senior Counsel with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I'm actually the founder of the Global Home Education Exchange and the Global Home Education Exchange work. We started it 10 years ago or so, maybe more, with a group of folks who saw homeschooling growing around the world, and we felt like there was an opportunity to serve people. And since then, we've grown to almost 20 board members from many different countries with a mission to advance home education as a human right. One of our foundational mission philosophies is that homeschooling is a human right and that it should be freely available to everyone, everywhere, for people of all motivation and all methodologies. So we're very inclusive and welcome people with all different backgrounds and interests. And as an organization, as GHEX as an organization, we are organized into three main operating committees. You're participating in the research working group, which is a program of the research committee. We have an advocacy committee as well as an outreach committee. You can learn more about what we're doing and how we do it at ghex.world. That's our website. Dr. Deborah Bell is the chair of the research committee. She's not present today, so I am standing in her shoes, which are very big shoes to stand in. We're very pleased with how our research work is going. It's something that is very important, I feel, in the area of education research and homeschooling especially. Homeschooling is, I believe, under-researched in the United States, but also globally. And at a time when schools are shut down, in many cases, although they are reopening now, and many children have been out of school, policymakers need to understand how home education can be a viable option for their country. In fact, I was up early this morning at about 2 a.m., spent about an hour and a half this morning presenting to the Moldovan National Assembly, which is the third National Assembly I've presented to, I think, in the last 2 weeks, as many policymakers are grappling with how to address homeschooling, regulation of homeschooling, questions around homeschooling. And Dr. Angela Dills is going to talk about that this morning. I'd like to introduce Dr. Albert Cheng, who is a research fellow for the Global Home Education Exchange Research Committee. Dr. Cheng is an assistant professor at the Department of Education Reform in the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas, where he teaches courses in education policy and philosophy. His research focuses on character formation, faith-based schools, and school choice. He's a senior fellow at Cardis, an affiliated research fellow at the Program on Education Policy and Governance at Harvard University, and a former math teacher at James Logan High School in Union City, California. Albert is also a co-editor and co-author of mine with the Peabody Journal, the 2019 Peabody Journal of Education, which was a special issue on home education. I highly commend it to you. And we also wrote the introductory article, and I will give Albert the lion's share of credit for that. He did most of the work, but I added a little bit around the edges. It's been such a privilege, Albert, to work with you over the years. We really appreciate you and are so excited about the work you're doing. You also have some new research that you're working on, and I want to just, again, encourage everyone to sign up for our research notes at www.ghex.world. You can click on the research tab, and Albert will be presenting in a few, I guess it's coming down to weeks now. I'm not sure when your presentation is with the Harvard conference, but Harvard Kennedy School of Education program is going to be hosting a webinar series on Thursdays over the noon hour for a few weeks. And I'll let Albert talk a little bit more about that, but I'll be presenting. Albert is, I think Dr. Dills is. So it's going to be a great thing. I really want to encourage everyone to not only register themselves, but encourage others to register also. So with that, Albert, please let me turn it over to you. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And just want to add my welcome to everybody here. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us around the globe. Yeah, and so just wanted to, again, remind folks of the webinar series that's about to happen here at hosted by the Program on Education Policy and Governance at Harvard. You see a web link there on your screen to sign up. So you do need to pre-register for the event, and keep in mind this is actually a series of events from May 6th through June 17th every Thursday, at least here on the East Coast in the US. Will be a research presentation or discussion on some homeschooling research. Our guest today, Angela Dills, will be presenting there as well. And yeah, I think I get to moderate one of those sessions. I let my co-author, Dan Hamlin, do the hard work of presenting. So yeah, please, I encourage you to register for that. Again, it's a series of events around the noon hour at Eastern time, US Eastern time. So anyway, without further delay here, I do want to introduce our speaker and guests today. Really happy to have Dr. Angela Dills with us. Dr. Angela Dills is currently a professor at Western Carolina University. I guess you have quite the long title there, the Gimbel Stop Landry Distinguished Professor of Regional Economic Development. I guess among our friends and colleagues, she's just an economist, but also a good friend. So, anyway, so just before I turn the time over to her, I do want to remind folks that to please, if you have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, and I'll be moderating the Q&A box and finding times to interrupt Angela with questions. We'll also have a concentrated Q&A open discussion time after she is done with the presentation as well. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Angela Dills.
Great. Thank you, Albert, Michael. I'm going to share my screen. And
yep, looking good.
let me just make them a little fancier for you. There you go. All right. Good morning. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I'm really happy in particular to be presenting my work to people so invested in homeschooling. Look forward to your comments and questions and to benefiting from your expertise. So please feel free to share and comment as we go, as Albert mentioned. So I'm going to preface this presentation with saying that the work is still somewhat preliminary, as you'll see as I get towards the end, sort of why, as I get into some of the empirical results, why I'm prefacing it that way. But I started working on this project almost exactly a year ago when Harvard Magazine published an article highlighting a recent law review paper by one of their law professors, Elizabeth Bartholet, which I would guess that many of you are familiar with. In her Arizona Law Review piece, she calls for a presumptive ban on homeschooling, primarily out of a concern that homeschooling permits abusive parents to isolate their children from the oversight of mandatory reporters in public schools. The image on the right is from that article, implying that homeschooled children are locked away in their homes while school children play. The law review and the publicity it received provoked a response from homeschool advocates, including some of those of you on here today. One of those pieces included the image on the left as a response, highlighting the police and the metal detectors present in many public schools, with schools locking children away while homeschooled children learn and play in nature. Regardless, it was a really timely piece, as Michael mentioned, coming out at a time when schools closed for in-person learning, when my own children came home from school and struggled with trying to learn virtually, and many families were both doing like we were, sort of spending significant amounts of time assisting their children attending school virtually. Other families were newly choosing to educate their children at home fully, or struggling to find other ways of struggling to find the ways to make the best of a particularly challenging situation. But generally, I suspect almost all families were spending significantly more time with their children, and in particular, more time involved with their children's education. For me, as an economist, I was really struck by the tenor of the debate around homeschooling. And given my own background as an empirical microeconomist, really struck that we knew relatively little about how homeschooling and child maltreatment interact. And as my natural sort of reaction tends to be when I get in these sort of discussions with myself or yelling at the radio or whatever, I figured I could contribute by learning more about that relationship. So what I'm going to talk about today is some research that I've been working on over the past year, which is looking at this empirical relationship between homeschooling and child abuse. I'm going to preface this with the caveat that most, if not all, parents and educators are concerned with the care and well-being and education of their children and their students. By necessity, the question here is that the worst actors in these groups, both among educators and among parents abusing or neglecting their children, educators abusing or neglecting the children whose care they are entrusted with. I'm going to briefly summarize some important points from this debate just to give a little context. I suspect most of you are familiar with it. I'm going to try to be even-handed and characterize the two groups as homeschool supporters and supporters of restrictions. So framing them both positively. Bartholet is quite clear in the text of her article that she believes that the current ease with which parents in the US can educate their children at home, that this homeschooling regime poses real dangers to children and to society, just quoting from her work here. The dangers include child maltreatment, including physical abuse and neglect, as you sort of read into the article, where neglect may include educational neglect specifically. Homeschool supporters point out that public schools do not provide a safe environment, a completely safe environment for children either. And in fact, almost 10% of children report experiencing unwanted sexual misconduct, let alone other forms of misconduct from educators during their K-12 career. Misconduct that also frequently goes unreported out of fears of bad publicity for the school and other consequences. In this vein, many states in the US have proposed, although not yet successfully adopted, laws that reflect the kinds of restrictions that these supporters are calling for. I'm giving just a couple here. If you go on the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, their website provides a database of sort of laws that have been proposed that may or may not have passed. But here's just to give you a sense of the kinds of laws that people are talking about across states in the US. Hawaii proposed a state bill to require background checks for child abuse and neglect before allowing families to homeschool. Illinois required an inspection from CPS, with Child Protection Services, to inspect the home for abuse and neglect before families would be allowed to homeschool. In Iowa, the proposed law was even more invasive, perhaps, in that if you were homeschooling, you would get quarterly home visits to check on the health and safety of children within that district who are receiving the independent private instruction sort of was changing some of the language to include people educating their children at home. None of these laws passed, but to give you a sense of the kind of legislation that is being considered across the US, I think it's helpful. To a great extent, and maybe echoing on the left, some of Michael's preliminary comments here, for homeschool supporters, the default is that those seeking to restrict parental rights by legislating rules around what must be done prior to educating your child, that those seeking to impose restrictions have to demonstrate need and effectiveness of restrictions. And in fact, my very loose non-lawyer reading of the precedent in the US is that the law is currently on their side, that Currently, parents have the default right to raise their children, including educating their children, as they best see fit. Supporters of restriction, including this quote from the Arizona Law Review piece, would prefer that the right occurs the other way, that parents would have the significant burden of justification, the burden of proof here, to request an exemption from from educating their children in public or private schools, perhaps including regular home visits or other restrictions. So a lot of this debate really centers on this legal question, but I'm going to focus on an even more narrow question. So we have a whole other pieces of the debate floating around here, which is sort of who gets to determine, who has to decide, who has to justify the schooling decision. But the question I'm really interested in is the first piece. So if we make homeschooling harder or easier, is that for families to engage in? How is that likely to affect the health and well-being of children? There's a little bit of research that exists on this already. So both the papers or both analyses that I'm aware of are using the database from the database that's Homeschooling's Invisible Children, which is sort of a collection of media items about sort of the fatalities that are related with homeschooling of children who were reported to be homeschooled. And both of these pieces of evidence sort of suggest kind of a weak relationship or no relationship between homeschooling and child abuse or child maltreatment. One piece of that's posted on the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. What they're doing is comparing fatality rates among homeschooled children and finding that they're larger, although not statistically significantly larger, than population rates of fatalities among non-homeschooled children. And Brian Ray, who I believe is on here this morning, hi Brian, has some empirical work as well, where he's looking at state homeschooling regulations across the US, and he finds no correlation between the stringency of these homeschool regulations and rates of abuse or neglect of homeschooled children. So statistically, what evidence we have is that suggests that the relationship's rather weak. And I think as an empirical economist, I look at it and see a lot of room for more analysis to help inform this discussion about that tale of children and what's happening to them as homeschooling becomes more or less prevalent. So I'm really interested in estimating a causal effect of homeschooling on child maltreatment. I have two really big problems with doing this, maybe three, depending on how we want to characterize it. First, I need some kind of exogenous variation in homeschooling. So I need something that's causing rates of homeschooling to change that's outside of current levels, in particular current levels of child maltreatment and other kinds of underlying family characteristics that may affect child outcomes. Okay. So I'm going to need some factor that changes with the prevalence of homeschooling. I'm also going to be really concerned, and I'll talk in a minute, about how to measure child maltreatment. But let me talk about the first piece. Okay. So measuring homeschooling, again, sort of reminding us of their preliminary comments here, there's not a lot of research on homeschooling, in part because there's not a lot of great data on homeschooling. It's really hard for empirical people to work through some of these interesting questions about homeschooling without the kinds of data and we need these exogenous changes in homeschooling to get convincing evidence that's publishable. So I think there's a lot of room here for more research, and I hope others will work with finding more of it. But I'm a little concerned about how to measure rates of homeschooling. In particular, in the US, it's not particularly well measured across states and time. Some states do an okay job of collecting data. I live in North Carolina. You're required to register your child if you're going to homeschool them. The state publishes data on counts of children who are educated at home by county, even by year and by county, which is great. Although after talking to Michael, I'm a little concerned about the quality of that data. But North Carolina is also unique. You don't have to, not all states do this. In the Peabody edition that Albert and Michael were talking about at the beginning, Corey DeAngelis and I have some work trying to sort of measure rates of homeschooling across states. So it can be done, but I'm a little bit concerned about trying to directly measure homeschooling rates. In particular, whether families homeschool it's correlated with lots of things that are hard for us to observe about families. It's correlated with their perception of the quality of the schools they have access to, the actual quality of the schools they have access to, their family situation, the needs of their child, all kinds of things that an empirical researcher is highly unlikely to be able to measure. So what I need in order to answer this question is I really need some sort of something easily measured that's going to affect how often people homeschool, but plausibly not affect other aspects of children's outcomes. And what I'm going to rely on are the laws that most states in the US passed in the 1980s and 90s, clarifying that families have the right to educate their children at home. So there's a nice paper by Roshana Bhatt in 2014 in the Journal of School Choice, where what she demonstrates is that these laws increase rates of homeschooling among young children, particularly among 5 to 8-year-olds. She doesn't find effects on older children, but she does find effects on younger children. So the benefit of using these laws as a source of variation is that I get some exogenous variation. The states adopt the laws. Presumably they're not adopting the laws because rates of child maltreatment are changing. So they're plausibly exogenous for the question that I'm interested in. And I'm going to I can see, well, what I can look at is whether when states adopt these laws, what happens to measures of child maltreatment. One of the big concerns here, so if the story being told by Elizabeth Bartholet is correct, if parents are using homeschooling as a cover for their abuse, then states with more abuse are automatically going to have more homeschooling. And so having these changes in the laws are going to allow me to separate out underlying unobserved characteristics of families with actual changes in homeschooling and how they affect child abuse. And I think given the legislation that lots of states are considering, and in fact, around the world, legislation that people are considering, this is kind of the question. If we make homeschooling easier or harder, what's likely to happen to child maltreatment and other outcomes that we may be concerned about? Okay. Then I have another hard question to figure out. Oh, well, let me show you the laws. So here, yes. So here's the states and when they adopted their laws. So these are the states that are in my sample. So this is not all of that changed their laws during the period that I'm able to look at. So you can see that lots of states, the ones that aren't highlighted, are states that are adopting them in the early to mid 1980s. So most of these states are adopting their homeschool rights legislation during the 1980s. A few sort of slower movers are adopting in the early and mid 1990s as well. But so this is the sort of variation that I have to work with, where US states are adopting rules that clarify families' rights to educate their children at home.
Okay. So, Angela, if I might interrupt you here just to kind of help ask you to clarify the kind of intuition behind how you're going to measure this. So essentially, you're going to compare states before and after some kind of legislation came up. Yes. And you know, if it's, and I guess the assumption here is that the onset of these kinds of new laws is going to alter the proportion of people who homeschool, and then you're going to basically compare that change across the time to your outcome. Is that
perfect?
Correct?
Yes, and I'll show you a little graph sort of demonstrating what I'm doing, but that's the general gist of it. So if, say, so Rhode Island adopts a law in 1984, and what we know is that that increased homeschooling, if that affects child maltreatment, if Elizabeth Bartholet is correct, then we would expect to see child maltreatment increase between before and after that adoption of the law in Rhode Island. Yeah, great. Okay, but then I have to measure child maltreatment.
Right.
So there's a couple of really challenging problems, right? We've got both of the things I'm interested in are not really that greatly measured across long periods of time and across space in ways that I can compare, right? So I need North Carolina to measure homeschooling the same way that Georgia does, ideally, right? We would like to have similar quality data across states. Okay, so how am I going to measure child maltreatment? So this is particularly a concern because part of the concern for those who are supporting restrictions is that what happens with more homeschooling is that more of child abuse is hidden, right? And so we're particularly concerned about measuring child abuse in ways that are well measured and harder to hide from the authorities, right? So we're concerned that homeschooling changes this degree of monitoring by the Department of Social Services, that's what DSS is, or by the justice system, to the extent that educators in schools are mandatory reporters. So if they suspect child abuse, they're required to report that to the appropriate authorities. In many states, that's the Department of Social Services. In some cases, that might be the justice system itself, going through the police department, for example. A couple other data concerns. If we're looking at child abuse, most child abuse is neglect. So a lot of the literature on child abuse is using the term child maltreatment because it's encompassing both sort of physical and sexual abuse as well as neglect. And the vast majority of child abuse falls in that neglect category. The problem empirically with neglect is that what constitutes neglect may be different from time at different points in time and may be different at different spaces, right? So what falls to the level of neglect may be very different in some states than in others. And I'm thinking kind of these stories you hear of families who are pulled in because they let their 10-year-old walk home from the park or something like that. If that's the standard of neglect, I'm pretty sure I neglect my children on a regular basis by letting them ride their bikes around our town, which is like has 2,000 people in it and is imminently quite safe. But the concern with neglect is this, that it's not a well-measured bar. Okay? The other empirical concern, if we were just to look at child abuse rates, is the vast majority of child abuse occurs to preschool-age children. A huge fraction of it is to infants, but also to 2- and 3-year-olds, presumably because of the intense amount of parenting and care and lack of sleep and other things, that the stressful sort of time that it is to parent very young children. Okay, so and when we're talking about homeschooling, generally speaking, we're not talking about 0 to 3-year-olds. We're talking about school-age children. So I'm going to think about how to measure child maltreatment with these sorts of caveats in mind. Okay, and the measures I'm going to use is I'm going to use 2 different measures of fatalities. So I'm going to use the violent deaths of young children, sort of reported from the National Center of Health Statistics through the CDC, our Centers for Disease Control. Violent deaths, I'm going to include 3 kinds of violent deaths: accidental deaths, homicides, and suicides. These are not necessarily deaths due to child abuse. They may be deaths, a homicide, maybe or a suicide, or sort of picking up other kinds of deaths as well as accidental deaths, right? So it is the case. So there's some research that looks at what kinds of codes children might report to their healthcare provider with that are indicative of child abuse, and lots of them are the kinds of codes that would lead to accidental deaths or homicides and the like. Regular falls and things like this that might be covering medical codes that are covering child abuse. I have to stop in 1988 for most of these, particularly for suicides and homicides, because not that many children die due to these causes of death, particularly young children. It's very uncommon, and the CDC suppresses the data for more recent years. So to get a broad sample of states, I have to stop in 1988, or almost all of the data is suppressed because there's too few deaths. The other big data source I'm going to rely on is the INDICAN data. They started collecting data on child abuse in 1990, and I'm going to use a couple different measures from them. I'm going to use fatalities, so sort of a similar measure as what I'm using from CDC. Empirical. I also do a decent amount of research on crime, and a lot of the benefits of looking at a fatality is sort of similar to the same problem with looking at neglect. Sort of empirically, the benefit of using fatalities is that deaths are well measured. So much more so than, say, neglect where there's a standard that might be different, or assault where there's a standard that might be different. I'm also going to use the data on child abuse reports from INDICAN. So these are sort of reporting through DSS and other child protective services agencies that are reporting to INDICAN to collect this data. I'm going to stop at 1999 mostly because that's when all the variation in my states is coming prior to that.
So just to clarify a couple of things. I mean, we got one question from Dorcas Quiroga that's come in. So just a clarification question. So your research aims to protect the homeschooling community by asking the difficult question, do parents use homeschooling as a cover for child maltreatment, assuming Elizabeth Bartlett's postulates is correct? Is that how you characterize I guess one thing your research can address?
Yeah, I don't know if my aim is to necessarily protect the homeschooling community. I think that I'm interested in knowing the answer to the question. I think if that question shows that homeschooling is coverage for child maltreatment, then I think it's one that advocates for homeschooling need to be prepared to address. I think conversely, if what I'm finding is that there's no effect on child abuse, then that makes this question a whole lot easier to address and for policymakers as well, right? So I kind of went into it thinking like, I really hope we find, I find something beneficial here, but the data is going to say what the data says. So and you'll see sort of it's not all roses, but I think it's an important piece of the story, right? I mean, if people are going to make claims, then we need to know if the claims are true, and if they're true, to address them appropriately. It is important, though, to keep in mind that, like, children, well, one, we're not able to keep all children safe all the time. It's just physically impossible, and it's always a comparative question, right? So it's a question of sort of where children are safer. And where safety is not the only concern either, right? So we're concerned about lots of aspects of children, not just maltreatment at the hands of their parents or their educators, but also sort of, I think something like 35% of school children are either bullied or engaged in bullying by their peers. So there's all kinds of other sort of abusive behavior that happens in schools as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if you could see the chat, but Dorcas, sends her thanks and says she finds it brave that you are doing this kind of work.
Well, thanks. Let's see if I still feel that way after this summer. I don't know.
Hey, Albert, could I jump in for just a second?
Sure, yeah, please.
I just want to camp on that for about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
That's really a good point. And one of the purposes of the research committee with Global Home Education Exchange is to foster all kinds of research. We believe that homeschooling doesn't need to fear deep serious inquiry in important questions like Angela's raising. We think we need research in this area, and I really agree that it is it's needed, it's courageous, it's important, it's difficult, but the research that Angela's doing is among the very first that I'm aware of people actually looking at this and trying to wrestle with the empirical challenges. So I'm hoping that she and others are going to be inspired to continue to look at this question, and we welcome all research, supportive and critical, because we think that's important. Thank you.
Yeah. I appreciate that. And I will say y'all have been very supportive. So thank you for that. And I mean, I do think, I will also say, I think this is really, what I'm going to show you is a really first step. I think there's a lot more that can be done. And so if you guys have other data sources or ideas, I'd love to talk more about it. So just to give you a little sense of the data. And so these are the death data, death by cause data. So death by accidental deaths, which includes a whole range of ways that you can die accidentally. Those are more common among young children, as you might expect. Suicides are very uncommon, particularly among 5 to 9-year-olds, as I hope we would also expect. We don't tend to see that kind of behavior starting until basically children hit puberty, and then rates increase significantly. I'm really only going to focus on 5 to 14-year-olds because mostly because Roshana Bott's only finding the effects of homeschool rights legislation on very young children. So one of the challenges, very few deaths by suicide, very few deaths by homicides. Is an empirical challenge, but a great thing for our children, of course. Accidental deaths are more common, so I have a little bit more flexibility with what I can do there.
And just for the record, can you kind of unpack that a little bit? You know, what's the exact problem with just very few deaths? I mean,
yeah, so
we all know this is a good outcome.
No, that's fine. So let's suicides are a great example. So let's say that, like, I'm looking at 50 states over 10 years, and you know, California maybe has 1 or 2 children die by suicide. The rates are a little higher than this, but let's say it was only California, and only had every now and then did a children die in that age group by suicide. I don't have anything to explain. Right. So if there's no variation in the outcome to explain, then I can't figure out how much of that variation is due to homeschooling, because there's nothing there to even work with. So the more variation you have in the outcome variable in the death data, for example, the more we can piece out sort of how much of the changes over time in deaths, accidental deaths, for example, how much of that's due to changes in homeschooling versus changes in like how many swimming pools people have or whatever. So
yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay, and then here's the data from the Indicans data from 1990 to 1999. So they have child fatalities. These are fatalities that they're attributing to child abuse per 100,000. So these are all per capita rates, and then a count of victims per 100,000. So this also maybe gives you a sense of how common child abuse is. So these are about 1,500 young children, young school-age children per 100,000. So that's like 1.5% of children in any given year are experiencing child abuse that's reported to DSS. So several caveats in that statement, but yeah. Okay, and so what I'm going to do, I'm not going to show you the equation. I'm going to show you a graph instead. Okay, so graphs
There's
are
still
better,
an equation there.
All right. So what I'm thinking about, what I'm doing is what empirical people would call these days two-way fixed effects, but we've called for a long time difference in differences, but it's basically the same thing. So we're thinking about states. So the blue line, for example, would be states that are never going to adopt a homeschool rights law. Okay, so, but they still have changes in child deaths and child maltreatment that are happening over time. So what I want to be able to do is say, well, here's a bunch of states that don't adopt the law during my sample period or never adopt the law, and what happened to their child maltreatment rates. And then the states that do adopt child maltreatment rates, like my treated states, are going to be the red line, and there's something different going on. So they're experiencing the same time trend in child maltreatment that all of states across the country are experiencing, but they're potentially also experiencing an effect of the change in homeschooling. And what I want to do is separate out that the states that don't adopt the law, my blue states, and the states that do adopt the law, my red states, might initially be different. But that they're both experiencing some common trend over time. And then I want to piece out any additional change in the states that adopt homeschool rights that's just due to that law. So what the method does is it allows me to basically take out any differences across states that are always there. So like we know North Carolina is different than California, is different than Georgia, and that's fine. That to the extent that those differences are the same over time, I'm going to control for that. And then we're going to take out any common national trends of what's going on. So, so any common trend in child maltreatment that's common to all states is also controlled for here. And then we're just looking at the leftover bits. And that's the part that I'm trying to, that I'm going to attribute to the passage of the law.
Right. So B would be the difference between, say, if blue is California and red was North Carolina. B is there's always some difference between those two states. That's B. Right. And then you're saying C is a trend that's shared by the nation. And so B and C, you want to take that out, and then whatever difference is left over is D, right? And that's going to be attributed to what homeschooling does to child maltreatment.
Exactly.
Great.
Okay. I debated showing tables, but I'm going to show you tables. All right. So what I'm showing here is just the estimated effect of the homeschool rights legislation on, this is first the CDC data. So the different causes of death. So column 1 is all the accidental deaths. Column 2 is the suicides. Column 3 is the homicides, and then by age category. So just to point out a couple things. So all of these are positive. So they're all positive numbers. Because the base rates here are relatively low, these are pretty large effects because it's not very common that these deaths happen. Almost none of them are statistically significant. The one exception is this on the bottom left, that accidental deaths among those 10 to 14 look like they increase after states adopt homeschool rights legislation. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge because we don't actually expect homeschooling to increase if we're among 10 to 14-year-olds, but we do see accidental deaths increasing. Okay. And then for, oops, I did not mean to do that. Let's try to not look at myself for a second. For the INDICAN data, these are the 3 measures that I have. I have fatalities per capita, and then I have child abuse victims. Here, what I'm finding differently is that fatalities are decreasing for these measured fatalities, and that child abuse victims for both groups of age groups are increasing. I'm going to give you a sense of the magnitude here just to well, you know, when you forget to put your printer paper in and it all just flies all over your floor, maybe I won't show you that. All right, let me see. I think I can remember it. So the magnitudes here are quite large. So if I'm just looking at that 340 here for the young victim, sort of what that would mean. So if we sort of back out, so Rashana Bhatt's saying that like among these young people, homeschooling increases like 1.4 or something like that percentage points. So if I multiply out, it's like 5,000 or 6,000 more children being homeschooled. And then these prevalence rates end up being that of those newly homeschooled children, something like 20% of them, those are newly homeschooled children, are experiencing child abuse. So those are significantly higher rates than we see sort of across the base populations. We kind of back that out. Maybe a little bit harder than seems plausible. So I have a couple concerns with the empirical results. One is that my fatality results are very different across measurements. And then they're also, these are sort of not consistent stories, right? So fatalities are decreasing, but maybe reported child abuse is increasing. And that's also sort of a challenging thing to explain. much of which ends up bringing me to some very, very interesting empirical. I'm really digging into how to deal with some of the empirical stuff. So just to give you a rough flavor, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but the other big difference between the first set of these results with the CDC death data and these results with the Indicans fatality data is they're looking in different decades. So my CDC data are looking in 1980, where I have lots of states adopting laws. And the Indican data are looking in the 1990s, where I have about 5 states who are changing their homeschool, who are adopting homeschool rights legislation during this time period. And they're different states, right? So my sources of variation are very different across the 2 samples, which is a little bit of a challenge empirically as well.
Yeah.
And let me know, Albert, how long you want me to talk, and I will.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, I guess I see you have a summary slide here. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and wrap this up? And
Sure.
there are some questions that have been
Perfect.
listed too. So
let me show you one more thing, and then I will. So the other
Yep.
thing I want to show you is this, which is that when you get from the Indican data, they'll also tell you who's reporting. And I thought this was kind of interesting. And one of the things that I do see is after states adopt homeschool rights legislation is fewer of those reports are coming from education personnel, which is what we would expect. And more of them are coming from the justice system. So this would be like police officers and others, or things like that. So there is a little bit of suggestion here that I'm just going to skip through all my fancy statistics. There is a little bit of a suggestion here that there's some changing in who's doing the reporting. But basically what I'm finding is some mixed results on fatalities, some big increases in child maltreatment rates. And when you dig into the data, sort of part of the challenge that I'm having is it looks like the states that are adopting the homeschool rights legislation have some significant differences in what's in their sort of underlying characteristics. So I'd love to know more, particularly from this group, about what might be different about those states that adopted these laws, that have chosen to be more explicit in who can homeschool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to take questions.
Yeah, we can launch it. There's been a few that are queued up here. I mean, just before I get to them, so one comment or suggestion with robustness checks. I mean, you were saying earlier in the presentation that states have the completeness of data systems across states varies. Actually, I don't know if we could do that with the NCANS data, but is there reason to believe that there's variation across states in terms of the completeness of it, and then maybe doing some kind of analysis restricting to the data where it's more complete, the states with data that are more complete? Is that possible to do?
Yeah, that's actually a great suggestion. It is possible to do. There are, so it is a voluntary data collection system that Indicans has, and so yes, I think I have to think about sort of what that looks like in the data, but I think that would be worth sort of thinking about is sort of in which states are more of the responsible agencies reporting their data to Indicans, and what do I see for those? That might help explain some of the differences.
And so just to kind of state, for the record for everybody that, so, Angela's research design, if you remember that picture with the C, or I should say B and C, right? There's differences across states at the same time, and then there's difference over time. And so if reporting of maltreatment, so Angela needs to assume in her analysis that the reporting of maltreatment is consistent across all the states. And if some states are more on the ball or other states have less complete data, then that's going to start affecting her results. But anyway, so let me get to some other questions here. So Lindsay Maxwell has a good question here. I'll relay her comment first. Thank you for this important research, first of all. So would it be reasonable to expect that child abuse rates may be even higher, given that it is likely more difficult for child abuse to be reported in homeschool environments?
Um, right. So I think I'm reading Lindsay's question as saying, I'm finding these relatively large effects on child abuse victims post homeschool rights legislation, and maybe they're even larger because there's one of the things that happens with more homeschooling is there's less reporting. Yeah, and I think that's a big concern with looking at the child abuse rates. So it's less of a concern in the sense that empirically it's a less of a concern because I'm finding a positive effect. And so I can say, well, it's a lower bound, right? And maybe the true effect is larger because there's more unreported. That does sort of make an assumption about, kind of grants the assumption that what homeschool families do are isolate their children. So it is the case that sort of the most common reporter of child abuse is education personnel. That's sort of the biggest category, and it's like 20-some% of child abuse reports come from education personnel. But lots of other people report child abuse as well. So that comes from medical personnel, the criminal justice system. So, but it also, one of the things that, maybe there's a hint of in my results is that while education personnel are decreasing, like there's a little bit more anonymous reporting that goes on. So you might think of that as like, friends and family, neighbors who don't want to say who they are. Friends and neighbors is another category as well, but that maybe there's other people. So, by saying it's a lower bound, you're granting the assumption that there's isolation happening. And it takes a significant amount of isolation for children not to have interaction with other adults that might feel compelled to report, whether that's anonymously or not.
Just a related question to this, because we're trying to think about what might be going on in the data, and then also maybe extrapolating to what things might look like today. So I guess this is the kind of external validity question. Just for the record here again, so remember Angela's data is based on, or her analysis is based on data from the 80s and 90s where there were changes in laws at the time. And so Mike has been in the chat, has brought up some related issues. So certainly, given the pandemic, we've seen lots of shifts in education. I guess Mike's quoted a figure here. The pandemic has increased homeschooling from 5 to 12%. Although I know among the crowd, there's probably, we could have a spirited debate about to what extent we consider some of that real homeschooling or not, or if it's just the, going virtual or not. But I guess Mike's question is, so if the premise that homeschooling results in more abuse, would we expect to see a noticeable increase in reports of abuse and neglect in the future? Especially given today, where a lot of virtual learning is happening and more homeschooling might be happening due to the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
so I think
in on that?
Maybe two pieces to that question. We'll kind of try to separate that out a little bit. So I think one piece that's really interesting is kind of thinking about what happened when children shifted when the schools closed last March, and all these children came home, sort of what happened to child maltreatment. I think the challenge with attributing that to having your children at home is that there's so many other stressful things going on, and stressed parents are not always the best parents, and so that can increase child abuse rates. So I think it would be really hard to call that, a causal effect of having your children home. Just because between the pandemic and how many families lost jobs and other kinds of stressful situations, it's a lot. We know that economic conditions matter. We know that those kinds of things are really important for effects on child abuse rates, and so it would be hard to untangle those things, but I think it would be, I think outside of the educational question, it's an interesting question in terms of child welfare, sort of how children were affected by having their schools closed. The second piece of that, which maybe I'm reading into your question. The second piece of that is that in general, homeschool rates have been increasing. Even prior to the pandemic, homeschool rates were increasing. And what are the implications there? And my guess would be this. So let's grant the assumption that there's a small group of bad acting parents who were abusing their children. You know, the typical story is they were abusing their children. They had a DSS call. They pulled their kids out of school to avoid any more interactions with the DSS or the criminal justice system. Okay, I suspect those families who are going to do that already did that, right? So the increase in homeschooling isn't coming from, unless we think there's an underlying increase in how abusive parents are, which I suspect is not the case, given that so many other things outside of current economic and health conditions have improved for most families. I suspect of those new homeschoolers that a larger fraction of those new homeschooling families over the last decades have been from families that are highly invested in their children and their education. So if anything, I would expect any effects to be smaller now than they were when homeschool prevalence was smaller.
Yeah. I mean, and on that note, kind of speaking about trying to understand and get a better sense of more recent data, Mike earlier had also chatted a question here. So are there data sources that let us measure child maltreatment in more recent times, I guess beyond the 80s and 90s? And if so, how might we design some kind of research question or analysis to basically conduct this analysis, but with more recent data?
Yeah, so this is part, Mike and some of his crew met with me earlier, and we talked a little bit about piecing data together. And so one of the things that I'm working on, although I probably after I completely finish this, is trying to code how different states have regulated homeschooling, how that has changed in more recent years. So again, what I really need is that variation and ease of homeschooling across states to give me a exogenous variation in homeschool rates. But that would allow me, the NDCAMP data I think Michael put up a link to the most recent child maltreatment report that they put out every year with the 2019 data. So they're still continuing to collect data. The child abuse data are available. There are long lags, but I think that would also allow me to look at more recent data in a sort of a similar way, but using a different source of legal variation. So I think that would be a good next project. It's just, it's proving a challenge. So if anyone has a fun interest in coding, like very differing homeschool laws, send me an email. We'll talk.
And again, this is part of this, I just want to remind folks here joining us that, part of having these forums is to just come up with new ideas and opportunities to partner and collaborate. I know we at the research board are trying to brainstorm ways of folks everywhere around the globe. I know there are some of you joining us are graduate students at institutions, outside the US where Angela and I are. And that's, one thing we do want to try to brainstorm is how to provide you all with more opportunities to actually do research with us. And so if this is a topic that interests you and you want to, have some taste experience of doing this kind of work, feel free to reach out and perhaps we can matchmake in some sense. So just to get to a couple questions here with the rest of the time we have left. So just kind of returning to the question of homeschooling now, or just thinking about how the pandemic experience is going to affect things. So Dorcas just had a comment, or an observation, I should say, that it seems that abuse rates have escalated globally, which is, again, not surprising given the relatively difficult year everyone's had. Dorcas has also observed that homeschool families seem to be doing better than other families. And then I'm going to combine this with a question that Brian Ray is asking. Could one then set up a study of abuse rates among homeschooled families during pre-government lockdowns, and then compare that with I guess data in the future, a year or two from now, to see whether, I'm going to have to, I should maybe read the question verbatim here. Could you then, Angela, set up your study of abuse rates among the homeschool during pre-government lockdowns, and then about a year or two from now, when the volitionally chosen homeschooling, not the crisis homeschooling home, settles down? Could you compare pre-post among the people today who select?
Yeah, so I agree. So I think both of you, both Dorcas and Brian, have sort of the same intuition here, is that those families that were already homeschooling, maybe, because they already had a routine, they already had a thing going on with their families. It was a less stressful time. It's still stressful for everybody, but there was less change in what they were doing as the government shut down schools and sent children home. And so it wouldn't surprise me to find differential changes in child abuse among those populations. The challenge is, and this might address one of the other questions in the Q&A, is when I'm looking at these, particularly with the CDC death data, which I like because they're comprehensive, but I don't know the educational experience of a child who dies in that CDC data. I just know that the child died. I still think there would be a way, right? If to the extent that different states had different prevalence rates of pre-existing homeschooling rates prior to the pandemic, and then the shutdown led, at least for the spring, I think every school shut down, right? So the fall decisions were very different, but that's also findable. I think there's good data on who opened and when they opened, and sort of thinking about how that affected states with more or less homeschooling prior to the shutdowns. I think that would be a really interesting question. And I think it's an important piece of the story, right? Because again, we're thinking about it not just a piece of it's an important question in terms of government policy and what are all of these varied effects that we would expect to see from shutdowns. It's also an interesting question about how families adapt more or less quickly, right, than say schooling does, which I think is an interesting piece here too, right? I mean, it's a transition. You get a kindergarten sent home to virtual school. Yeah, that's going to go great. That's what we had. It was tough. And I think every family had very different experiences, but I suspect the families, in fact, if we look at states where schools have still not opened, the families have figured out something that works.
Couple related questions here. One by Lisa Treleven. Again, I apologize everyone if I'm butchering your names. I just haven't met all of you in person yet. And then also Christopher Cordero. Again, a related question. I'll kind of combine the two. So Lisa's wondering, so if you find an increase in reported child abuse after homeschooling rights laws are enacted, is it reasonable to consider whether the possibility that the increased rate in homeschooling actually led to a decrease in isolation among homeschoolers, and so that might, could that lead to a higher instance of reporting existing abuse rather than an increase in the actual rate of abuse? So I guess this is a kind of interpretation with the data. I mean,
yeah,
you
I love
say
this,
if you're
Lisa.
picking up an actual increase, or is it just exposure?
Right. So that's a great point, Lisa. It's one thing. I work in a county where 10% of children are homeschooled. And that means that there's a whole lot of resources for families who are homeschooling in the community that probably weren't there when only 1% of this small rural county was homeschooling, right? So I love that point. I think it's a really useful piece, and I will make sure to add it. So thank you.
Yeah.
You know, I'm picturing co-ops, and we have homeschool Boy Scout troops and homeschool gymnastics classes, all of which happen during the school day, and would also increase interaction of homeschool children with other adults in the community, which is an important part of sort of thinking about reporting of child abuse. So thank you. That's a great point. Michael, do you want to say something too, or?
Well, just to get more precise on Christopher's question. You know, again, he's, you know, extensive thanks for this research. You know, so I'll just read it verbatim. How would spanking, moderate physical chastisement impact these abuse figures? If laws changed regarding, say, spanking, parents may have removed children from school, but these still get added into the abuse figures. So I guess maybe there's this question of I guess what's getting counted in the abuse figures, and whether that
so I think that's a great question. So there's a couple big concerns I have with the child abuse reports, and I think that sort of speaks to one of it, right? So something like 70% of child abuse, child maltreatment is neglect, including educational neglect. And educational neglect means like not providing your children with adequate education. It would not surprise me, given what I read in the news, that like there are families who are unschooling their children, and their friends and neighbors think that that's educational neglect. And that, you know, so even outside of sort of changes in what constitutes, or what a standard is of what constitutes child abuse, like spanking or not spanking, you know, where is that line? I think this is generally a problem when we're thinking about reports instead of something that's more easily measured, not easily measured, but yeah, there's less subjectiveness as to whether a child is dead than whether a child is abused. So the nice, sort of the beneficial aspect of looking at deaths is that it's clear what happened.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm looking at all the different deaths that are not necessarily child abuse, they're not coded as child abuse, is that like any sort of questionable death, you know, we might have differences, and there's sort of known differences in what gets coded as homicide versus suicide in the US versus in other countries. And some of that's a choice by the person filling out the death certificate in that state. So I agree. I think it would be interesting. That does sort of prompt a question. I went to school in Arkansas when I was very young. We still had capital punishment in school at that point in time. But I think it would be interesting even to know when states changed their positions on capital punishment, not capital punishment, I'm using the wrong word, corporal punishment, thank you. Corporal punishment in schools, when states stopped paddling in schools and things like that, because that probably indicates also a change in sort of standard, which would be interesting to capture.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions here. Well, we have about a little over 5 minutes left. So broader question, how is homeschooling defined in this research? I wonder if there may be helpful data to be gleaned through online learning programs, especially if they have data on student use of counseling and support resources. So I know this is probably going to get to a kind of a key approach that you've taken. I mean, you've taken this state level view rather than individual data. And I know there's an IV in there, I guess, but so could you kind of maybe touch upon how is homeschooling defined in this research?
Right, so I'm not taking a stand on homeschooling in this research. So I'm looking at child outcomes overall and using this change in legislation as a proxy for an increase in homeschooling. But I'm not actually doing any measuring of homeschooling in this data. I think it might be interesting particularly if thinking about doing similar research with more recent years, it would be important to think about whether that state had a virtual schooling option where children were learning at home. I think that's an important piece, particularly in modern times. I think it's obviously less of an issue in the 80s and 90s than it would have been, than it would be in more recent years. So But I'm not taking a stand at all
Yeah.
on what homeschooling is or isn't here.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, you're observing states before and after the enaction of new laws, and right, we're kind of extrapolating that to what that does to homeschooling and child maltreatment. So last question here from Douglas Petersma. I hope I said that fairly accurately here. Would it be reasonable to break the study down by state or even country to get a perspective of the variance of abuse based on when the laws and trends in the state have changed, and then doing a meta-analysis of the various studies to extrapolate a broader picture, because the data of the states are affected at different times based on local changes in law or data reporting? So it sounds like a slightly different approach. I mean, you did a kind of looking at all the states together. Would there be some kind of analog to doing it state by state and then re-aggregating via meta-analytic techniques?
Yeah, so I like the idea. I think it's probably worth digging into some of the bigger states, particularly the bigger population states, particularly, as well as those with higher rates of homeschooling, and sort of thinking about sort of ones where we might expect those prevalence changes to be more important, and tracing them out. I think another piece of the question that Douglas has is kind of getting at one of the empirical issues with using the method I'm using with the two-way fixed effects with the different dips, which is that because states are adopting the laws at different points in time, and there's long lags in how families respond and other sorts of questions, that partly I'm addressing this in the paper by doing an event study kind of analysis, which is going to trace that out across states. But I think there would be a lot of value in looking at pulling out a few states at least, if not doing them one by one, and kind of tracing out what their path looks like. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, I want to begin closing our time. We're almost out of time here, and I just want to point out too for everyone that as Angela said at the beginning of her presentation, that this was still very much a work in progress. And as you can see, even as she presented this work, lots of folks had questions and comments and suggestions that pushed all of us to think about this issue more rigorously and thoroughly. And so this is all part of the process of doing research. And so not all research has to be fully done or at some state where it's ready to be published. I mean, this is all part of sharing our work and talking about it, and coming out hopefully at the end of our kind of the discussion a little more having thought about it more and a little more enlightened because of that. And so I just want to encourage all of you, whatever state your research is in, feel free to share it with folks, with people that, your friends, and just to talk about it, because a lot of good scholarly work is always, I know, Andrew, you said you started working on this a year ago. So, these are long processes, long journeys, and along the way, we improve by coming alongside others to present our work and share our work. So anyway, I saw that Angela had left her email in the chat. So you should feel free to follow up with her if you have any other comments, questions, or suggestions. And I'll hand it over to Mike to kind of close us out.
Let me just say thanks one more time.
Yes, please, Angela. Go ahead and finish. Yes.
Thank you all for your comments and questions. I really appreciate it. Sorry, Mike.
No, thank you, Angela. Thank you, Albert. Great job moderating as usual. Angela, thank you so much for being part of our Research Working Group series. Your research is very helpful. It's cutting edge. And I hope it inspires other people to ask the questions. That's really what this is about, is about pushing people to ask these important questions, dig into the data. It may be inconclusive, but let's keep working at it and try to find new data sources and better ways of cutting the data. And my own suggestion might be, you've taken on a very expansive and daunting task of trying to look at this on a national basis. It's challenging. maybe getting at it on a state level, or even a municipality might, a large municipality might have data that's available. So some enterprising researcher who has time and interest might look at that. So anyway, I want to thank Albert for his moderating. Angela, thank you. We did put in the chat box a way that you can sign up for our research information. We are going to be working on a newsletter. We're always looking for ways to increase our support for the research community and ways to connect those who have an interest in researching home education. Thank you for our international participants. This is a global effort. GHEX is a global organization with a global mission. And so we're very grateful for the support from our American scholars, but we also are looking to expand our connections globally. So if you know people in the research community who are doing work on home education research, positive, negative, whatever they're doing, please let them know about what we're doing. I do want to just reemphasize what Albert said about the Harvard Research Symposium. Please sign up for that. And with that, I want to thank all of our participants. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Angela, for participating today. Thank you all for attending, and I wish you all a very good day. The seminar is now ended. You're free to leave.